Hello there, and welcome to this first episode of the Enactus Tilburg Friends podcast. My name is Lennard, and in this podcast we sit down with interesting people from the Enactus Tilburg network. In this case, our first guest, Joshua Eckblad, former entrepreneur, lecturer at Tilburg University, advisor of Enactus. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for recording this first episode with us.
Yes, so we tried this, I guess we can say, right? We tried this last week.
No secrets.
And had a great discussion, so let's hope
the magic didn't wear off.
It'll be interesting also for the viewers and for the listeners.
Yeah.
And we should also say that we have somebody else in the room.
Yes, we have Chinenya, the other half of the podcast crew. So Chinenya and I will be sharing duties. One of us will be interviewing, and one of us will be producing the podcast, and we swap that around a bit. So you'll be seeing her, more of her in future episodes as well. So how are you, Joshua? What's been keeping you busy lately?
Yeah, a lot of things. So I'm actually working on my PhD dissertation at the moment, and also teaching and doing some other things. But the focus right now is on that research. It's pretty intensive.
And so what's it about? Can you tell me a bit about it?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So, my experience and my practitioner experience, as you explained, I was an entrepreneur, is on that small enterprise kind of firsthand experience with small teams. And we were in high tech, and we were working on some really interesting projects that involved artificial intelligence. And so we were also working with some large companies. But I didn't have very much knowledge or understanding of how they functioned in terms of how they worked with startups and also what their purpose was in terms of innovation. So my dissertation work actually is looking at those large corporate firms that use what sometimes are referred to as corporate venturing units in order to invest in startups that they would like to work with. But it's not simply about the money, it's not simply about the investment, it's actually about forming some kind of relationship where there's then work on the technological development of new products and services. So that's what it's basically about.
Cool. So that's done in a way that's mutually beneficial. Is it usually beneficial for the startups as well or does it end up being the big company that gets most of the...
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's quite a bit of research on on sort of situations in which the large firms appropriate and let's say misappropriate in some ways the knowledge from the smaller ventures, from the startups. So there's quite a bit written about that. My interest is in looking at where it's mutually beneficial. Right. So I think it can also be very mutually beneficial. And I'm interested in understanding also the processes of these units in terms of how they relate to business units inside the large firm and how they're also negotiating the way in which the relationship could take place. So in some ways they can shape the quality of that relationship.
Yeah.
And ensure also that it's not misappropriating knowledge and that both sides are benefiting.
Yeah, right. So you mentioned that you worked in startups and you collaborated with big companies in that time. What was your experience like with that, and what kind of things did you develop, for example?
Yeah, so my experience with large organizations.
Yeah.
So much of what we were doing, so there were different startups, but they were basically all sometimes what's called B2B or enterprise facing. So we were developing systems that were very expensive, very complex systems that ran into the millions, that were then installed at the client. But these systems, because they're so complex, and also because they're making some changes, some very important changes in terms of existing workflows, a lot of that work is much more than just technological work, or let's say configuration work, like you might think of certain software systems that are out there. this was very much about working with those companies very closely, and sometimes I would spend weeks there on site, looking at and learning about all the workflows. So observing how people worked, observing how information was moving across the organization. And these organizations with thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of employees, actually sometimes hundreds of thousands, but of course I'm not observing that many employees. But what I'm looking for are the different divisions and how information is transiting between those divisions, and then essentially what is the nature of the information that needs to be communicated, and how are they currently doing it, and then how can we improve on that. And so the experience on the one side with large organizations was actually going in and studying them and observing them, and I always found that very interesting because they're very complex. It is really an interesting experience to have, because maybe you study that, or you get the impression maybe through some of your studies that things are highly orchestrated, and that strategy itself is something that is strictly top down, and it's always sort of sufficiently clear, and the means and ends are communicated in a clear fashion. But once you start looking at organizations, and researchers who do so know this also, that there's such complexity that things don't quite happen in such a neat and clean fashion. So and there can be a lot of kind of contradictions or duplications that take place. So that's the interest, that's one side of what I found very interesting. Now, in terms of actually working on projects together, that was always sort of tough. There were a lot of challenges in terms of the different speeds, working at different clock speeds. So we can't survive if it takes us 3 years to put in some kind of pilot project. So we have to move fast. And yet most of the people that we were interfacing with at these large organizations, they had a lot more time, and they wanted a completely different clock speed, and they weren't going to go out of business if it did take them a year longer. So there were some complexities there, and that's part of what I also find interesting in the research.
Yeah. So how was that? How would you resolve that, the kind of conflict of interest?
Well, it's not so much a conflict of interest there, but I understand what you mean.
Yeah,
Maybe a conflict of interest in the sense that the interests are not maybe as intense. So from the startup side, you have a very intense interest in that relationship, because it's also a way for you to improve your product. It's also a way for you to understand really your customers much better. And of course, it becomes a reference also, which is very helpful then for marketing purposes, to be able to then mention to others that you've worked with this particular, very visible brand. That does help a lot. So I would say that in some ways there's, I guess you're probably right. The interest is a lot stronger on the startup side in some sense. Let's say the urgency is the way to put it, which can feel like interest, because on the other side, because perhaps there's sometimes less urgency, you also have people rotating through roles, and so that also creates complexity, because then you, as the startup, you're having to work with different people as people change roles, because of the fact that it's taken a certain period of time.
Right.
And so there's quite a bit of mobility inside the large organizations where people don't often stay in the same role for very long. Yeah.
So do you think it's possible for a large organization to be as agile and dynamic as, let's say, a startup? Or do you think it's in the nature of large organizations that they move slowly and,
Yeah, so this is a pretty big question. And of course, I don't really have an answer. No. But there's a lot of research, and really interesting research that's been done over the last at least 40, 50 years on this, where there are different thoughts about it. And so, I guess everyone sort of agrees that there are complexities that have to be dealt with, and that fundamentally large organizations do very well also because they have routines. So they have practices that they repeat, right? And so there's a kind of let's say, path dependency. There's a kind of way of doing things, or the ways that we'll continue doing them. And you could say there's a kind of energy behind that inertia. And so, I mean, fundamentally, that's probably true in most cases. And so the challenge, I think, for those large organizations is to find ways in which they can nurture change, and that they can operate at different speeds and have certain units or certain moments where they're engaged in exploration and not just exploitation. So not just continuing to generate the revenues that they need in the short term, which are very important. That's the cash flow, right? And that's the lifeline to the organization. But if you're too much in that, and of course you have to be to a large extent, because that's how you keep the business going. But if you're strictly on that routine and exploitation side, well, then you're not developing the exploration side, which is basically learning to adapt to changes in the environment that are taking place, with or without you.
Yeah.
And so I guess some of the approaches have been to either set up separate structures to do that, and so that's where corporate venturing units also come into play, which is, what I described earlier, what I'm studying. And they're all different types of units. They go by different names. Sometimes they're accelerators or incubators or labs. I mean, they have all different types of names associated with them. And so they are a way to work on these kinds of projects where they get to have more space, and they get to explore, and they get to try and fail, right?
Yeah.
But then this has sometimes limited success, and that all depends on so many other factors based on the organization's policies and its other routines, because these units are not completely separated from, and they can't be, right? Because they need to come back and make impact.
Yeah, right.
To the organization. So it's a very good question, but
yeah, it's of course impossible to answer in this time.
Stuff to look into, yeah.
Yeah. So after all these years in kind of going from startup to startup, you went into academia. What made you make that switch?
So the transition. So it's a very it's a very difficult switch to make. It's a very there's a stark contrast between those two kind of fields. But I always was interested in understanding how things work, and thinking about them more deeply, and taking the time to do so. And even though you also have to work under a lot of pressure and research, and you do have to deliver things rather quickly as well, you do get a chance to look into those kinds of complex social situations, right? We're here in the School of Economics, but it's a kind of social science, and we get to understand better how organizations work, and we get to look at it either from a more micro point of view, where we look at teams, or we can look at it from a bird's eye view, where we start seeing whole populations, so entire industries, and there you have maybe millions of data points. And that's interesting, right? As a startup, you have your own first-hand anecdotal experience, and of course you're talking and connected to many other startups and different intermediaries, like venture capitalists, who you're also learning from. So you do get exposed to a lot. But research is an opportunity to really look at things at a different scale. And that's a very interesting piece of work. But I can't give you like a rational, answer to why I made the switch. I think it was just something that was always in the back of my head, and just something I enjoyed. And then I went away from, during my 15 plus years in entrepreneurship, and as an entrepreneur also tried to look at things analytically, but didn't get that kind of time to spend, deep dive on a lot of things. Whereas now there's not just more time, but there's the space, and it's the environment we're in is to do that.
Yeah.
And we do that through the research, and also even through teaching, where I learn a lot also through the teaching process as well.
I see. And do you see yourself, like, if you would go back into entrepreneurship at some point, Do you think this kind of analytic view that you've been allowed to take for the past couple of years, do you think it would help you? Do you think you gain insight?
Of course, yeah. I think the sort of analytical view. There's some skills also that go with that, right? So there's some data science skills. So if you think about it, basically anyone who does research, or let's say most people who are doing research, at least here at the School of Economics and Management, are quantitative, and they're dealing with quite a bit of data. And so there's a lot of data science to it, and techniques using different statistical packages and programs. So I personally like R. And I do all my work mostly in R, a little bit in Stata, but those are the kinds of skills that are then, I think very helpful in any field. So we get a very good training, and by doing it also on an almost daily basis, you're not just getting better at it. It's such a vast number of techniques and such a vast set of constraints also that you encounter, right? It's very easy to say you do data science, but when you're actually doing it, and maybe you could say something about that as well, Lennard, since you're also doing this kind of work, there's so many areas of constraints. Right. So many things go wrong, so to speak, and a lot of that work is actually learning how to deal with that, and understanding the limits of what you have, and then understanding the value essentially of what you have. And there's so much complexity in that. I think that just saying data science makes it sort of look like it's like a black box where there's an input and somehow it all just kind of magically comes out and we get some valuable insights. There's actually just a lot more to it. Yeah,
like that input has to be generated in some way, and I think that's if I were going to say something about it, then the thing, if you study something like this, or if you learn data science skills in your own time, but you don't really apply it, I guess the risk you run is that you only work on toy problems, where indeed you do get to kind of construct this black box and the inputs are perfect, and
so starting with those toy problems is a great place to start, and starting with some of those platforms that are online, for learning Python or for learning R, different things like that. It's great, a great place to start. But where it gets really interesting, and I think where it can get very valuable, and where even startups can use this kind of insight, is when you start working on those real problems that are very, very messy. Yeah. And you even have to kind of work through what is it what is the thing that I'm looking for in all of this data, and then where's the noise in this data, and then where does it sort of all go wrong, where it's leading me towards a direction, but there's a kind of systemic error of some kind. And so it requires a lot of judgment and awareness of your data, and then that's hard to do as the data gets larger. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually enjoy on projects going back and forth between projects where I just have maybe a few thousand observations that I'm looking at. So for example, right now I'm working on something where I look at this set of opportunities that a corporate venturing unit has looked at. So that's basically a list of startups that they've looked at over a certain number of years. Well, that's a much smaller list, and I can actually then triangulate that information. So about each startup, I can go and look at other data sets and really get to learn and understand the opportunities that they considered. Whereas on some other projects, there are millions of data points. And so there you also try to find a way into it where you can do quality checks and make sure you understand what you're looking at. But at some point, there's a level of abstraction, Yeah. And that's always the risk, I think.
Yeah, cool. So just going back a bit, like in the years since you've came here to Tilburg University, I guess you could say entrepreneurship has gained a lot of traction at the university. There's been a new bachelor that you teach in. There's all sorts of, there's an incubator, the Iconic Incubator. There's student organizations that have been, getting up to speed. So it seems that there's a lot of interest in this, in, students wanting to be entrepreneurs or having an interest in the kind of, skills associated with it. And what's some advice that you would have to students who want to get into this kind of work?
Into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, into entrepreneurship.
Yeah, so I think there's different ways to think about entrepreneurship, and even the new degree program that we created is called Entrepreneurship and Business Innovation. And the reason it has both isn't because business innovation is not part of entrepreneurship, but it was just a signal clearly that you can actually practice entrepreneurship in different contexts. So I think we all think about, all of us here sitting here, I think we think of entrepreneurship as only small venture creation. And of course that's one type, and I guess that's the type that seems most attractive, especially to those people who haven't done it, because it's also incredibly tough, and lots of trials and tribulations are part of that scene. But there's also the chance to do strategic renewal in different types of organizations. So you could also do it in government. You could do it in institutions like this of higher education. You could do it in large private companies or large publicly listed companies. So a lot of the innovation is also happening in those contexts. Right?
Yeah.
So there is a lot of it happening. There's also a lot of people involved in that, and there's also a high likelihood that a lot of students will end up working in large organizations. And then the question is, well, do you have then the skill sets, and then do you have, can you accumulate the experience to then know how to lead those kinds of changes in these very complex situations? Because starting a startup with a couple of friends where you're each, you have your kind of specialized roles or let's say capabilities that turn into certain kind of roles. So maybe somebody's the head of the technical side, the CTO, and somebody else understands how to work with investors, so it might be the CEO, things like this. You deal with a lot less, even though you have very few resources, you're dealing with a lot less complexity and a lot less frictions. So you're more fragile, and there's certain kinds of complexity, like finding the product market fit, which is a very difficult problem to work on. But you don't have to deal with the kind of level of social complexity that exists in large organizations of any kind.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's a different set of skills, I think. Or let's say it's a context that really tests certain types of skills that you might still need in a small venture, but it becomes different when it's at that scale. So I think that's also really important, is for students to learn. So I would say, yeah, just get to know more about yourself also, and understand whether you even like change, whether you want to be part of that, whether you want to be leading it. That's also, I think, the first question, or the early questions, because maybe it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll find a way, their own way through it. But yeah, it's tough work, affecting change in any context, and it's grueling, and it's not it's not celebrated until there's some kind of successful event, and then you're looking backwards on it, and then maybe there are a few people that are celebrated for what they've done. But for the most part, it's just tough work that you have to love doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because I guess it's a good thing to mention that, because it tends to be, in the media, I guess, glorified a little bit. Being an entrepreneur, that is kind of like being a superstar, but it is, of course, only once you've succeeded, and even then, the road has never been easy up to that point.
It's never been easy, and entrepreneurship is not something new either, right? It's been around for a very long time. It's never been easy. You could say on the financing side now, you could say to some extent that's become easier because there's so much capital, but at the same time, it's still a very, very small percent, very small, really could be well under 1% of startups that ever receive venture capital funding of any kind. So it's a very, very small percentage to begin with. And then out of that group, there's also a very, very high rate of failure. And that could be okay in the sort of the career of a startup team. They may not find success in their first venture, and they may eventually get success. So that's not necessarily a problem to fail, other than it obviously it is to the investors that invested in it. But it's also just very tough. So it's not just a question of saying failure is okay. It's just there's a psychological element to all this where you're so invested in that work, and so failing is a very painful thing, even if afterwards you can see some of the lessons and then try to do better the next time. But it's very, very painful because you're fully committed to that.
Yeah, and I guess since you're so committed to the startup you're in, you also run the risk of getting some kind of tunnel vision early on like this product is going to work or this service will work. And you don't really see the red flags along the way anymore.
The challenge is to stay open to new information and to update. So a kind of Bayesian approach where you might have a starting point and there could be clear reasons as to why you believe that to be true at this point in time, but then you should have good processes in place that help you update that information. And I think actually startups are quite good at this. It's one of the things they're very good at. And that's part of the whole idea behind Agile or any other technique, because Agile is just a kind of, I guess it's one that's become popular, but of course this way of working is preceded Agile, and there's many other ways or names that it can go under. But the idea fundamentally is to do things incrementally, and you do it incrementally because you're experimenting. It's not that you're doing it incrementally in a kind of slow fashion, it's you're doing it incrementally because you're allowing something to keep changing over time. And that's because you're getting more information and you're running these little experiments. And so I think this is something very, at least in high tech, very familiar to us, and a very common way of working is to run these little experiments constantly. And from that you learn and you adjust and you move. So I think that does happen a lot. And large organizations are also starting to kind of work, especially in these corporate venturing units or labs or incubators or accelerators, they go under different names. They are also starting to work in this more incremental, more experimental fashion with their end users to constantly get feedback to adjust the products and services that they're developing. So yeah, I think some of these practices are also starting to diffuse. But yeah, to go back to your earlier point about sort of the media treatment of entrepreneurship, of course you're seeing the most visible examples of the successful entrepreneurs, and that's great. I mean, it is great that that's celebrated, and that is great. But yeah, you do have to kind of put into perspective that very few companies ever get venture capital, and almost always those that you're seeing with those successful exits, whether it's initial public offering or some kind of acquisition, almost always those have been invested by venture capitalists. So it means you're really looking at a very, very small subset of a subset. Yeah. And despite the increase of capital, part of what's happening is it's not necessarily going to a wider set of startups. So it's not like everyone is necessarily benefiting from the extra capital. It could be that and it seems to be to some extent, that it remains in the same sort of investments as before, and so it could just raise the amount of money that's given in any particular round. It could raise the number of follow-on investments that are done in the same companies, or it could just be investing in more companies but in similar types of spaces. So it's not like that increase necessarily is making it easier for everyone to get access to it.
No, I see. Yeah, that's interesting to hear. So going back to like the thing about maybe it's not for everyone, entrepreneurship, and this kind of dealing with change in a complex context. To what extent do you think it would be nature and nurture? And maybe you noticed that in yourself, like when you started out, did these kind of things come naturally to you, like this way of constantly experimenting and updating your assumptions, or was that really difficult?
So I think I just want to make sure that my point about the saying is, I'm not sure I said it was not for everyone. I want to make just a point there where when I said you should get to know yourself well, it's, I think entrepreneurship can be just about anything that has to do with some kind of renewal and some kind of change. And I think most human beings are involved in that, and they adapt, and it's how we live our lives. So I think there's an element of that spirit in all of us. Mm-hmm. The only thing I was pointing out is when you're thinking about the type of work you want to do, you're exposing yourself if you're really out there trying to affect some kind of significant change, my only point there is just to say that it's just very, very tough work, and it's not like it's always welcomed, and it's not like you will be welcomed, and it's not like you're always supported, and it's not like you're celebrated along the way. And that's part of why I think there's very strong communities. In any kind of city, you've got these very strong communities of entrepreneurs, and I think part of the reason is because it's a kind of support system, that we need. And I remember myself going through that and needing that, and it helps, right? When people are going through similar situations, even though it doesn't change your situation, it just helps to know and share that and share your stories and not be judged So I think that's the point there, is to just say, just how much do you want to be in those roles where you're exposed in that way. At the same time, I think you can affect change in so many different ways. You don't always have to be also in those kinds of very visible roles, but if you can find ways of understanding the current situation, and you can use tools to understand where things are going, then also that's a way to contribute to change, is to provide some of the insights, and maybe that's data driven, and provide some of the insights to help the decision makers understand the possibilities going forward.
So if you're not a risk taker, probably wouldn't advise you to go into entrepreneurship because it's a risky business.
I don't know. I think I would hope that people affecting. So the question was, in case it didn't come through the microphone, was whether I would encourage people who are not risk takers to get into it. And there's a lot of complexity to that question, really, because on one level, it's, of course, you need to be comfortable with the level of risk you take, because there are consequences. So if you're really exposing yourself, so either setting up your own individual venture, that's one form, right? Of course, there's some risk because it's an opportunity cost. You're not developing other skills, and you're not developing other networks where you could be in a large organization doing that, right? There's an opportunity cost. Now, it's not, it depends on the context, so I think now there's more of a chance of that actually helping you eventually even get a job in a large company than ever before. But still, there is, in hiring practices of large companies, there tends to be a kind of track, and there tends to be a kind of pattern that they're looking for the most part. And so anything that ventures outside of that is a risk, and there are trade-offs. So of course you have to be comfortable, well, you have to understand that and be realistic about that, and then consider that, because that's real, and it could have a significant impact on your career. At the same time, if you are that person, you don't really have a choice about it. And I don't know whether it's nurture or nature. I think it's a combination of both. But if you sort of grew up hacking, and by that I don't mean necessarily breaking into computer systems, but experimenting with things, building things, taking them apart, and I did that. I started with wood, and then electronics, and then got into computers. But that spirit of hacking and just taking things apart and recombining them and rearranging them, I guess it could come at any age. But if you have that urge, then that's what drives some of those decisions, and that's why they may not be rational. But the more you yourself are intrinsically motivated to do those things, I think the more comfortable you are with the consequences. But to think that there are no consequences to doing that, is where I would urge people to think, and not just be attracted to the shiny part that they do see in innovation theater. Sometimes it's called, and there are lots of people contributing to this innovation theater, and some media, of course, it's part of that. And the celebration of a few really well-known, that we all know, right? Some of these entrepreneurs that we all know, and I'm sure that they should be celebrated, but it can distort the picture as to how likely those outcomes are, and distort the level of downsides that are involved. So you see the upsides, right, in those cases, and a lot of them will talk about even their own downsides in terms of the difficulties they went through and the relationships. A lot of them, their relationships didn't survive those situations, and friendships and all that kind of thing. So they do somewhat talk about their downsides increasingly, but there are lots of other downsides for people who go down that route that could derail some kind of career. So I don't know. I don't really have any specific piece of advice about it. I just say, yeah, know what you want, and then I think then you can be comfortable with your choices.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice, I think. Yeah. So now that you've been working in a large organization for a couple of years, do you feel that your hacking spirits, that you can still kind of use that, or is that a bit do you feel that you can still get creative like you did in your entrepreneurial days? Within Tilburg University, like now that you're in academia.
In the university setting. Well, I think there's, kind of conceptually, there's no reason why you can't, because a lot of what we do is based on individual choices. So the way that we teach and the way we design our courses, the way we conduct research, we have a lot of choices about that. And so there's no reason to think that you can't kind of be creative at it, and I think lots of people are very creative in that work. But it's a different context. It's also it's very high pressure because we're at a research university, so there's also a lot of pressure, and I'm not sure that all students understand that most of the people who are lecturers are researchers, and they're also supervising master thesis students on complicated research projects, and they also may often have an institutional role as well. And so it's a very demanding type of work. It's also really satisfying. You have to. I guess it's like being an entrepreneur in that sense. It's mission driven. If you believe in the mission and you're passionate about it, then that drives the rest of it. And quite similar in the sense that there also is often a blurring between the personal and the professional spaces in this kind of work as well. Just like there is in entrepreneurship, there's no kind of work and play and fun and work are one and the same, and meaning is constructed through work, and it's very similar in this context as well. And it's similar, I guess, in the sense too that there are a few that really are very successful at it.
Yeah.
And those are the ones who end up with the title, even though students call everyone professor. There's actually very few individuals who reach this status of becoming who have the title of professor. And it's just as rare as those successful examples that you see in entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And so it is truly remarkable. And along the way, there's lots and lots of people who are on this tenure track who are like entrepreneurs, trying to develop their research agenda and trying to create a body of work that has value. And then there's a selection process, and also very few of them are selected. So yeah, it's a very high pressure, very competitive, and also just very you're around just extremely interesting and knowledgeable people. So I love that part of it.
Yeah. It's interesting to see those parallels, like that you kind of have those entrepreneurial aspects in academia of building your research portfolio, and vice versa, that you also have in entrepreneurship that things tend to be a lot more analytical and experiment driven than you might think.
So I would say probably in most cases with entrepreneurship, in terms of the individual ventures, that side of entrepreneurship, right? Because I want to make sure we keep a very nuanced. I think it's important to have a nuanced view of it to realize it can express itself in so many ways, and it can express itself also here in the university setting. So it's probably more experimental in some sense in that setting than it is in the research setting here, where a lot of things are driven by theory, and it's by a understanding of what has been done before, and then you're looking to make some kind of incremental contribution to that. So there is probably a slightly more top-down driven kind of practice. Yeah. And also the other part is that at least everything I experienced and everyone I sort of know in the entrepreneurship space, so the new venture creation space, has done it in teams. It's always been team-based. And this team is experimenting in real time together and building things bottom up through experimentation, and could also be, and is often, analyzing situations. So there's a combination of deductive and inductive type thinking. And then, of course, reading up also and understanding industry, so there's that abductive side as well. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on as well, but you're experimenting together as a team. It's a very collaborative, real-time collaboration kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that can also go sideways, because that's one of the major issues with those kinds of new ventures are the team dynamics and teams that fall apart. And that's very common. So even though you may start with a very strong team, very few teams survive it.
So that's something to really get right at the start. So you don't.
Yeah, it's hard to know if you get it right. Because so many teams start as best friends, or at least very much respecting the capabilities of the other individuals, and almost always making a very selective choice about who will be part of that founding team. So that's not done, because I'm talking my experience was not of teams coming straight out of university.
No.
My experience was we were slightly older, and we had a lot of choice about how to compose those teams. Yeah. So it's a very deliberate, thoughtful process. And so, you think you have the right team. Time reveals so many things.
Yeah, and I guess if you've never been in such a high pressure situation with those people before, you can't really know what will happen if you are.
Yeah, it's the high pressure, it's the psychological toll. So you have ups and downs, and everyone has their own cycle. So I guess what's also very helpful is if you have opposite cycles, so that if you're feeling really down, so it's very typical to feel up and down like 5 times in the same day.
Yeah.
You get good news and bad news just constantly. And it's nice to have co-founders where if you're feeling super down, they're up, and then they bring you back up, and you just play off of each other like that, and you're playing off each other like that.
Yeah.
So you make a point of bringing the others along when you're feeling strong, and then vice versa.
Right. So in that sense, being with the team can also really help.
Yeah.
Push you through those difficult moments.
Yeah. There's so many of those difficult moments, and so you want other kind of these cycles to work to the benefit of team level. And of course, then also, if you're really working on tough problems, you need those capabilities, very distinct capabilities, and you can't possibly be the best at everything. So you also really depend on other people, and I love that, and I found that to be just the most fun part. I think I was less interested in the business side, and in that sense, the growth side. To a certain extent, wanted growth, but I wasn't after the super speedy scale kind of approach that a lot of investors would want to see. That wasn't really my intrinsic interest. My intrinsic interest was to work on tough problems, assemble great teams, and then just work it through together. And that process was just incredibly fun and meaningful, and I loved it.
Yeah.
And in the process, we did create some value sometimes. And value for the investors, but also for companies that were using the solutions that we developed. So there was value generated, but it's just a question of where's your interest, where's the focus. And I think some entrepreneurs may be very driven towards a kind of financial objective at the very end. which of course is important, and it's also indicative of success of your product, right? If you have that objective and if you've met it, a financial objective, it also means that there's been traction in the market and that you're actually making an impact. It's just different people are driven in different ways, and I was a little bit more driven, and then some people are driven entirely by the engineering side.
No.
Yeah, and I had a kind of mix between the two. My interest was really about the business side, not in terms of financial, but in terms of working in more collaborative ways. So working on solutions that increase collaboration in organizations was really where I was intrinsically interested. And then to do that, I knew that I had to have capable technical teams and people driven by the engineering side. And then also, of course, people driven by the finance side, because all of this required venture capital.
Yeah, so it helps having those kind of different drivers in your team. And yeah.
And I guess the same person could have multiple ones.
Yeah, like a mix, like you had kind of, yeah. Sorry, what were you saying?
Any more questions, do you have?
I don't really have a list, but it's good to check the time. I think we're running into our time.
Producer duty.
Yeah, it's just that
Yeah.
towards at some point I wanted to cut it, but then you started saying stuff that I'm like, this is good material.
Yeah, I mean, it's all been good material, I think, but...
It's good material. Just some points I was like, this is really good, like video material especially. Like this could be used in like an ad for it. Yeah.
You know what I just realized is the lights have been off the entire time.
Oh, right.
It's a sunny day. So
Yeah, it is.
really
It's absolutely beautiful fall day here.
Yeah.
And we're up on the 8th floor. And maybe we can show an image afterwards with the fall colors.
Yeah, the view is only getting more beautiful this time of year.
But yes, we have a game for you.
I mean, we actually...
Should I turn on the light or not also?
I think this is fine.
Okay, because then you can adjust maybe the whole video at the same
like
time.
this.
Yeah, if it looks fine, then we can keep it like this. Well, actually, we did the game in our first recording of the of this episode.
You can just
So I think I'll just...
hear the answers.
I mean, I don't have the questions with me.
Just say it was a recording issue. That's why there was a first episode that didn't. Well, why we're doing a second, not really second episode, but a second version of the first.
I think I'm just going to show the score.
The scoreboard?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to... Yeah, indeed. So this is actually the second run. But I think we didn't lose our magic, so it was still...
What's interesting is, I guess it's normal, but this was an entirely different conversation than we had the first time.
Yeah, I mean, you could...
And it was great the first time also, but it's interesting how, I guess it's my first podcast, or first time speaking on a podcast, and that's the interesting thing, right? It can go in so many different directions.
Yeah, could do it 10 times and it would be 10 different podcast episodes. So that's interesting, yeah.
So hopefully it's good for you. Hopefully this was good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for the audience, this was Joshua's score in our quiz segment last time. Perfectly halfway through, so that's nothing to be ashamed of. I could bring it a bit more, yeah. Sorry. There you go. So this will be a recurring segment and we'll see how he stacks up against future guests. I guess with that, it's called Guest to the Test, indeed.
What is it called?
Guest to the Test.
Okay.
So there you go. All right, with that said, I think we've come to the end of this first episode. So I hope you enjoyed watching it, and thank you again, Joshua. Thanks, it was a really great, interesting discussion.
Thank you so much to both of you for the invitation, and and I hope your viewers get something from it. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. All right, we'll see you next time.